All right. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, this rainy evening here in Connecticut. My name is Christine Lai, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Special Education Legal Fund. Welcome to SELF's June webinar, our last webinar of the school year, the year in review. I'm so pleased this evening to welcome everyone who's joined us. We have assembled an incredible panel of special education legal talent this evening, and I'm really excited to hear their takes on this past year, as well as their outlook for 2021, 22, and beyond. Although this is our last webinar of the school year, please follow us on Facebook or Instagram at SPED Legal Fund for updates on next year's webinars, which we expect to announce before the fall. Special Education Legal Fund is deeply thankful for the support of our corporate parent education program partners, Winston Preparatory School, American School for the Deaf, Chapel Haven Schliefer Center, Fusion Academy, the Pinnacle School, Spire School, Villa Maria School, and Hubbard Day School. A special thank you this evening goes out to American School for the Deaf. American School for the Deaf has very generously provided the American Sign Language interpretation services for the webinar this evening. Please welcome our interpreter, Marie Langell. Thank you to the American School for the Deaf. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about the oldest school in the country that serves deaf and hearing impaired students, please check out our April blog post on our website on their autism expansion program, which is educating hearing nonverbal students with autism through a bilingual ASL curriculum. Before we begin, I want to share a few words about Special Education Legal Fund for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Special Education Legal Fund, or SELF, was founded in 2018 to provide grants for families in need with children in the special education system. In the 3 years since our founding, we have provided approximately $360,000 in grants for legal support from qualified special education attorneys to nearly 100 families in 37 school districts across Connecticut and Westchester County. We are just about at the conclusion of our third year and will be accepting applications through June 21st. For more information about the grants or how to begin the process, please send me an email at christine@spedlegalfund.org. My email's up on the screen, and I will put it in the chat later on in the presentation for anyone who's interested in learning more about the program or about SELF. To apply, families must answer a pre-screening questionnaire, receive an application, complete the application, and then provide a time for an interview with SELF. The applications for our June cycle are due, as I said, on June 21st, and that includes the phone interview. So if you want to apply for this last grant cycle of the school year, please make sure to submit your application a few days before the deadline so we have time to schedule the phone interview. Families are eligible for the program if they have adjusted gross income of below 300% of the federal minimum poverty line, which is $76,400 for a family of 4 in Connecticut. Child has to have a current IEP and must live in Connecticut or Westchester County. We are also pleased to announce that we have recently started our advocate support program, which provides grants of up to $1,000 to families in need with a student with an IEP or 504. Families in this program have to live in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and they will be eligible to receive support from an advocate on our approved list. This program will close in June of 2021. So if you're interested in this program, please email me at the email below to start the process. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist of today's webinar. Adrienne Arcontaki is a vice president of the Cuddy Law Firm and the managing director of Cuddy's Westchester office. Her practice focuses on special education advocacy and litigation, as well as special needs estate planning. The Cuddy Law Firm, for those of you who aren't familiar, was established in 2001 by attorney Andrew Cuddy and has since expanded to include offices in Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. We're really pleased to have someone of Adrienne's breadth and depth of expertise on the panel this evening. Welcome, Adrienne.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome. Andy, if you are at all familiar with the landscape of Connecticut special education law, you know Andy Feinstein. You may be familiar with his steady and knowledgeable presence on Seek This Week, Special Education Equity for Kids weekly Facebook Live broadcasts that he and the founding members of SEEK have faithfully hosted on a variety of special education topics for families throughout the pandemic. For many families, this weekly series was an invaluable source of timely information and resources during a difficult and challenging time. Attorney Feinstein is a pillar of the Connecticut special education legal community and a staunch advocate for students and families. And we are so pleased to welcome him back to his second webinar with us. He also throws a mean holiday party.
Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome. Next, we have attorney Michael Gilberg. We are so pleased to have attorney Gilberg join us this evening. And while this is Michael's first self-webinar, back in pre-COVID days, he was a valued panelist along with attorney Piper Paul at one of our parent education seminars on special education law held at Winston Prep in Norwalk, Connecticut. Attorney Gilberg's approach to special education law is from the perspective of someone who has lived the special education system themselves as a former student who now practices law on behalf of students with learning challenges. We are so pleased to welcome Michael to our panel this evening. And last but not least, we are so excited to welcome attorney Courtney Spencer to our panel. Attorney Spencer has been a longtime supporter of Special Education Legal Fund. She practices law on behalf of families with special needs, or has practiced law on behalf of families with special needs for over 20 years. And she provides them with a wide degree of expertise, knowledge, and support across the areas of special education, special needs trusts, and so much more. Welcome, Courtney. The disclaimer. This webinar panel is presented for informational purposes only. This webinar is intended as a resource for families who are navigating the special education system in Connecticut or New York, and is not intended to provide legal support, advice, or assistance to any particular individual, nor is it intended to replace the advice and counsel of a qualified special education attorney. This webinar should not be construed as an endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives of any of the participating attorneys in the panel. For webinar participants, this panel should be viewed as a public forum. Please do not ask questions via the Zoom platform about your child or your child's legal or educational situation. Please email questions to me at christine@spedlegalfund.org. I will put it in the chat. And in your question, please refrain from comments that include identifiable information about your child, including name, grade, school, or school district. And please remember that your screen name may be visible to the participants in this panel, as well as the panelists and Special Education Legal Fund. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and may be distributed or shown at a later date at the discretion of Special Education Legal Fund. So welcome, everyone. It's been a crazy year. I would like to, first of all, kick off the panel discussion this evening by asking each one of you to name your top 3 takeaways in special education law this year. You know, what trends have you noticed among the cases you've been involved with? And separately, what's been the biggest surprise for you this year? We're going to go in alphabetical order. Adrienne, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. I think the challenges are obviously COVID, the ability of the districts to provide, remote learning to the standard that they should. Obviously for us, the big case was our Yorktown case. And how the districts are now handling coming back into the classroom. I think those are the things that I'm most concerned about, and what we're looking closely at.
Perfect. Andy, you want to go next?
Let me say 2 things. Item 1, money, money, money. The amount of money given out by the federal government, especially for special education, has been massive, and particularly to Title I distress schools. That it is our job, and I'll talk about this more later, to make sure that money is spent wisely, that can have a long-term effect and can actually improve education. And the second takeaway is equity. This is a year where there's been a tremendous amount of focus on that. There's been real concentration on police and schools. There's been new legislation banning restraint and seclusion, and there's in the money packages, there's a maintenance of equity provision, which we fought to get in, that ensures that the most impoverished districts get the most money, which is the way it should be. Those are both massive additions to special education, because as we know, special education has tended to work very well for the benefit of people with the resources and not so well for people without resources.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. Michael, would you like to share your thoughts next?
Sure. Thank you, Christine, and thank you for having us. I think what I've noticed is a lot of kids, and I focus a lot on social emotional learning, given my own background, are seeing a regression in their social emotional learning because kids who already have challenges in making friends, having social skills, are so isolated that they're losing that ability to connect with peers, because it's very hard to teach kids how to interact socially when they're at home with their parents. I'm also finding a lot of kids who just are not learning as well on Zoom. I think I've had one child I represent who's actually benefited from the distance learning, while the vast majority have just suffered from it, and they're losing they're not accessing it in the way they used to. And I think what's going to be a very interesting trend, and I know Courtney wants to talk about this as well, so I don't want to steal her thunder, is how it's affecting them in terms of their mental health. At least that's my kind of takeaway on this year.
That's a great segue. Courtney, would you like to talk about what you've noticed this year, what the themes are for you in your practice?
Yes, I'd like to take 1 minute though and just thank you so much, because especially with the impact of COVID, parents have less resources to access people like us, and we want to help everybody. And without your organization, there are many families who would be in dire straits right now. So I just really wanted to highlight how important having you here is for our families, and just thank you so much for doing these kinds of things and for helping our people. So,
well, I couldn't do it without all of you.
So for me, obviously, as Michael indicated, mental health was bad before. It's really, really bad now. It's this suicide is the second leading cause of death for, I think it's like 14 to 27-year-olds. The depression, anxiety rates were really high before COVID, and schools couldn't handle them, and now they're through the roof, and schools can barely handle basic any disability at this point, but certainly not mental health. So it is scary for me right now. The second issue is lack of services. We talk about compensatory services, recovery of services, but the lack of services for some students during COVID. And as Andy said, there's an equity issue. So depending on the town you're in, you may have gotten great services, you may have gotten bad services. So that's the second real issue of concern for me. And the third is just really, how are we going to recover? Where do we go from here? And again, it's going to depend on the town you're in. It's going to depend on the ability of the staff to really address what's going on. And so we have a big problem, a big gaping hole problem that we do need to fix.
Absolutely. You've sort of segued into so many different and important topics, mental health, equity. I mean, Andy touched on this too. I know for my part, one of the things that, has most shocked me this year is that, before the pandemic, before this year, I didn't have applicants very often who were coming off of a mental health related hospitalization. And there have been certain months this year where that has been more than half of the applicants that we've seen are students that have multiple hospitalizations, ICAPS, et cetera. So that's been a real something that I've noticed obviously this year, which reflects what you were saying. Maybe a couple of you or all of you could touch on, how have different school districts reacted to in the last year? How have they deployed the resources that they've received, or, in some cases not received, but the resources they've received from, federal and state monies, has that caused them to change their ways of thinking and operating? And have you seen any school districts that have really stepped up this year?
I have. I can't name them because I think that may be unfair.
Yeah.
But I've seen a massive discrepancy. So
Mhm.
I've had some board attorneys tell me, oh, we don't really, like, especially last spring, we don't really have to do anything. We're not obligated to do anything. And now we're getting compensatory services to towns that stepped right to it. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with finances. So if your parents all have Chromebooks for their kids, it's going to be a different story than if it's a town where very few parents are going to have Chromebooks for their kids and they have to navigate that. So it really comes
Internet
down.
access.
Sorry?
Internet access.
Internet access.
Internet access is a big, and access to that is obviously to broadband. Internet access is a big thing as well. So yeah, absolutely.
It's a poverty. It's like a, depending on the affluence of the town, will depend on the level of service you get. But I always say special ed is an equal opportunity problem. So you can be rich or poor and be a kid with a disability, and you're gonna suffer. But this is where we saw the highlight of the discrepancy. If you're a person of color, if you're a person who's in poverty, you really the level of what happened to those students with special needs was more significant. So it's been hard.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, one of the major concerns was that there was, frankly, no guidance from anybody as to what school districts should do. The feds did provide some useful guidance on March 20th of 2020, surprisingly. But then, the states, both New York and Connecticut, just basically punted to local school districts. And this is an issue that sort of united both sides. The board the superintendents were telling me, why don't they just tell me what to do? And so you had one town that was all remote next to a town that was all in person. On all these various issues, there's no guidance. And the most critical issue, I think, coming up in Connecticut, or one of the most critical issues, is the fact that, again, the governor decided, well, it's up to districts as to whether they go back in all full-time next year. Many districts have announced that they're going to, with leaving no remote option. And that is a real problem for families where there's an immunocompromised person in the family, and having a kid go to school and come home is giving the family a choice between the life of a family member and the education of a child.
Yeah.
I'm pressing, had meetings both on the federal and on the state level, trying to press for resolution on this issue. And, we're not getting very far, but we're pressing on that issue.
Adrian, you've got a pretty broad view of, not just of, this, sort of tri-state area, but, across the country. What has been your experience as you look at kind of your, New York versus, Texas versus, the other, parts of the country where, where you all practice?
So, the first thing I want to say is I agree with both Courtney and Andy that in New York, I mean, the lack of planning, it was like, the districts woke up one day and we practice a lot in New York City, right? So you look at these larger districts and it was like chaos. And, I'm not sticking up for anybody, but I'm saying the DOE, they tried, but then, it was massive number of students that needed, the devices, and then they needed internet access, and they were trying to get the kids internet access. And this happened in Pennsylvania too, and in Cleveland. But then a family where, I'm picking on Verizon or whatever, would say, oh, we're going to get internet access to everybody. But then when the family owed some money on some bill, they were like, oops, we can't, provide them with internet access. So it was chaos. I mean, it was literally, there was no planning. And so as a private attorney, I'll give you an example. When we had to shut our office in Valhalla, I have 6,100 square feet, right? We're a paperless office. I'm looking at Andy's, I don't know if that's a real background or if it's, if it's not, but
It is
that
a
would
real
never come-
background. It's
right?
totally
real
real.
background. So you would probably come to Valhalla and go, oh my God, they don't have a stitch of paper, right? So we didn't miss a beat because we were able to go to this paperless system. Everybody was able to work remotely. That didn't happen in the districts, you know, even the ones that could try, and New York City did try, or several districts in Westchester, they did try, but you know, trying doesn't really fit the bill. So, you know, where we had kids who all of a sudden had to go to remote learning, the parents were without job, it was just chaos. And in Pennsylvania, we have an office in Center City, but we service all over Penn. You know, at first saw the districts, I think like Courtney said, we're not going to do anything. We don't have to do anything. And I took pressure all of a sudden to say, no, you have to provide the services. And what we did and what we're still doing is looking at how many of those services really weren't provided in remote learning. Okay. Where are the records? Where, you know, it was a disaster. And the lack of planning to me was really the biggest challenge. It was just chaos. So I think we're only now seeing like the residual of what happened. And now we're going to see the regression, as Courtney said. Now we're going to see all the problems as we come out of it. And that's my biggest, you know, that's my biggest concern here, and trying to recover. You know, trying to recover. So you know, we're just moving along.
I wanted to jump off of what Adrian said as someone who practices in both New York and Connecticut. I do think I've seen, like Courtney and Andy and Adrian all said, some districts are better than others. I won't even go into New York City because that's an animal unto itself. But I think and like Adrian said about being paperless, I've always tried to work as paperless as possible. I tell clients, I want everything electronically, and I've encouraged districts to send things electronically. So for me, it was a little more seamless because I've always worked more virtually and keep a low overhead. But it is a different experience having a CSC meeting or a PPT in Connecticut. I sometimes fall into the New York terminology virtually, because you don't see the people across the table. It's, I think, much harder to assess credibility on Zoom. And I think, like Adrian and Courtney said, we're seeing a lot of the effects now. I was said to a number of parents that unfortunately, you're not getting what you need right now, but I can't get you the compensatory services you want now because of COVID. You basically have to let it go poorly until things go back to normal and get the compensatory services later, because we can't demand them now while COVID is still going on. And in terms of the funding, I would defer to Andy on that. He's the expert. But it is definitely a difference in how districts operate based on, you know, I think it's also what I've learned is based on who their attorney is. Unfortunately, if you have a district with a good school board attorney, they're going to do the right thing in COVID, more or less. A district with a bad attorney, you're going to have them do less of the right thing. I think it really depends, because I've had a couple of districts that have dug in their heels on things during COVID, and a couple that have bent over backwards to really help the students.
I do want to clarify some nomenclature here. So compensatory education is a legal remedy that you can get from a hearing, you can get from a state complaint that compensates, that tries to place the student where the student would have been had there not been a denial of FAPE. It's a no-fault statute. The denial of FAPE doesn't have to be the fault of anybody. It just has to be a loss of FAPE. Compensatory services, on the other hand, is a phrase that started in the March 20 guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, and it is now being used as a scheme of voluntary providing catch-up services being provided by districts. And it's being widely encouraged for districts to do it, and some districts are engaged in such programs and other districts are not engaged in such programs.
Now, is this happening, Andy, sorry, is this happening over the summer? Is this being like overlaid onto, you know, what would traditionally be extended school year? Or is this happening during the school year and during, you know, regular education?
Well, I think it's basically a plan starting in the fall. I mean,
Okay.
You know, extended school year can be used to compensate for lost services. And in some cases, it is being used for that purpose. But the real encouragement of the federal law was that to use extended school year as enrichment, as an opportunity for
Yeah.
kids to re-engage, to deal with the social emotional deficits that came about. So, I mean, I think we have to be clear that comp ed is what lawyers sue for, or or what you get from state complaints. Compensatory services is this whole different scheme, and what it means and how it's being implemented really varies widely from district to district. But there are some districts engaged in that effort.
Just to dovetail on that, Andy's absolutely right. And the state guidance, it's guidance, has encouraged districts to do that. If you know you haven't provided a special ed teacher or a speech and language pathologist, you provide the services, and it's not limited. So it can be after school, before school, whenever. But compensatory education, as Andy said, is a legal remedy that I've gotten it through a state complaint, and I've gotten it voluntarily, but typically it's through a due process complaint. It is a hard fought remedy. The benefit of it is it's not hour for hour. You can get years of compensatory education.
Right.
And it's something you do if, a district's going to say, yeah, we didn't provide the services and that's just too bad. And we do have those districts. Then certainly a parent has the right to try to pursue the compensatory education. Obviously, ideally, you always try to work with the district first. And if that works, you don't see people like us, right?
Yeah.
But if it doesn't work, we are the people that could help get those services for you, because there is a legal entitlement if you've been denied FAPE. And it doesn't even mean that you had to miss specific services. If you've been denied a FAPE for a period of time, you can get a private school. There's a lot of different remedies that are compensatory in nature. But what's new now is that there is this encouragement for those compensatory services to be voluntarily given, which I think is probably the very best solution that you could do short of litigation.
That's a great point. And actually, thank you, Andy, and Courtney, and Michael for clarifying the difference between, comp ed, and comp services, and all these different pieces, and especially how it plays in as we're going into the summer, which is traditionally a time when, all students slide a bit. Now we're looking at that period. A lot of families I know are, as a time where maybe we can catch up and we can make up some for some lost instructional time during the year. Are there other areas that, you've seen that have been significantly impacted by the pandemic? And, and by that, I mean, how have you seen identification be impacted by the pandemic? Is it are students being identified for services with as great a frequency as prior to the pandemic? And how has the lack of in-person observations impacted, IEEs and that very, very important parental parental protection that we have?
Well, I'll start if you don't mind. I will say that during the pandemic, the identification of students with disabilities took obviously a big dive. I mean, it was, again, for parents to come and say, my child needs special education services, the district would obviously, in my practice, say we can't, we can't do the evaluations, we have to wait. So that piece of it for me took a big dip. It's been a challenge. The evaluations, what we've done with our private providers is when COVID hit, we spoke to every single one of them and asked, can you really do these evaluations remotely? Will you get the data you need? And so we really took a few weeks and really spoke to them about how they would evaluate the student. And the districts, for me, they wanted any way possible to hold off on the evaluations until they figured out, how long this was going to be. So it was a challenge. It really was a challenge.
I would agree. The spring was a little bit ridiculous. I kind of gave everybody leeway for a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was we're paperless too. We transitioned pretty seamlessly, but mentally you don't transition to a pandemic seamlessly. It's like, when's it going to end? Everybody thought it was going to be 4 weeks, fine. But then after that, it's like, come on, some of these referrals were made in September, and now everything was blamed on COVID. Oh,
Yeah.
can't do
Right.
this. Oh,
Yeah.
and we can't have PPTs. Yeah, you can.
Well,
You can have them.
you know what,
Yeah.
Courtney, that brings up a good point, because exactly, they couldn't hide behind COVID,
Yeah.
and everything was, we can't have the CSE until we can come in person. And after a while, we tried to be understanding, but we were like, no, everybody, we're doing Zoom meetings. Enough is enough here. So we gave them a little bit of time. But then it was like, we're not waiting until the fall to take care of these kids.
The big evaluation issue now, I mean, I think things have sort of got back to normal in terms of evaluations, even though a lot of has not been as in person as it should be. But the big issue now is all those kids who are suffering from anxiety and trauma
Yeah.
during COVID as to who would newly qualify for special education.
Yeah.
And districts in some cases are saying, oh, it's episodic. You really don't have a disability. We're not going to qualify you. We haven't really seen the onslaught of that yet.
Right.
I expect that come September, with most kids back in school full time, we're going to face challenges that we've never expected.
Right.
We're going to face kids who have been dysregulated for a year, trying to get re-regulated. We're going to see the results of trauma, particularly in those communities, and those are, again, the communities in poverty and communities of color that were particularly hard hit by COVID, where kids lost people, lost parents. And we're going to see a level of trauma that's been unparalleled. And, while there's continues to be downward pressure on the eligibility rate, which has been creeping up pretty steadily, I think we're going to see a large jag in eligibility for kids who, anxious, nervous, school avoidant, trauma related due to COVID.
I actually think, I do think that it's there's less awareness about how mental health falls underneath the umbrella of IDEA, at least amongst the families that I talk to. So a lot of you have these sort of things that develop on an ancillary basis because of what's happened. And a lot of families don't know that this is a qualifying, this is something that it qualifies them for support. So, that's something that, I feel like at least I would like to spend a lot of time, trying to raise, families' awareness of is how much that mental health piece, deserves support, or is entitled to support,
Right.
I should say,
I think,
under this umbrella. That's super
I
helpful.
wanted to add,
Yeah.
sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, Christine. I think Adrienne just hit the nail on the head when she said it's about the children. The school districts will say, well, we can't do this and this because of COVID, but these children are still there. The children don't get put in stasis. And so then we forget it's about the children. And I think what you're saying about mental health, Christine, is critical, because like Andy said, there's going to be all sorts of new traumas and kids identified. And Courtney mentioned statistics before on suicide for young people, and people might not realize this. The leading cause of death among people on the autism spectrum without an intellectual disability is suicide. And you're going to see a lot of autistic teenagers who are going to have mental health issues, comorbid, and the schools are going to try to dismiss them because of the autism and say, well, he's autistic, it's not a mental health issue, and not see the comorbidity of these kids being, as Ed pointed out, dysregulated. And I think a big part of the problem is the schools are going to have taken the attitude of, it's not our fault that we didn't cause COVID. Yes, you didn't cause COVID, and yes, it's not your fault, but you still have a responsibility to educate this child so they have the maximum chance for independence. But unfortunately for the school districts, COVID is going to cost them money, and they don't want to spend that money.
And I would just like to, you take the child as you find them. So, it's a little bit better now, but I remember a few years back, well, it's because the parents are getting a divorce. Well, it doesn't matter. If my client is anxious, in and out of the hospital, depressed, can't go to school,
Right.
I really don't care what caused
Why it is. Yeah, exactly.
care.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's too bad. And then the whole, it's a medical issue. Well, it's an issue that impacts their education. So there are cases where we get residential placements for students with mental health, with the school district biting and dragging the whole way,
Mhm.
because you don't want that, obviously, unless it's necessary. It's a last step, but for some kiddos, it's the only way they're going to get an education and stay alive. But yeah, school districts, they have a very hard time handling mental health issues, despite the fact that we had the Newtown shooting in Connecticut, despite all the issues we're having, despite suicides. There are suicides in most high schools. Some high schools, there's a suicide year. You don't hear about them because parents don't want to share that, and that's their right. It's a huge issue, and yet I still go to PPTs with suicidal kids, and oh, that's not a school issue. And my thing is, it's if you take your own life, you're going to miss some school. So yes, it's a school issue. So parents do need to understand mental health is a category. Emotional disturbance sounds scary, but it's a category of disability. There's also other health impairment. But if a student's mental health is impacting their education, impacting their ability to learn and get services, they can absolutely qualify for special education and should qualify for special education. But we also need to have trauma-informed staff. So having a school counselor who doesn't have a trauma background get a kiddo who's been socially isolated, anxious, depressed, maybe emerging psychiatric issues, it's a disaster. You know, bullying's gotten even worse because there's so much online stuff going on. And then kids also lost some social skills through the masks, through the not just being, I mean, really they were online. So they're watching TikTok and, you know, Instagram, and now they're having to have relationships again. And school districts really have to be prepared because bullying's always been an issue that was not well addressed. And now we've got to deal with it on a huge level. So proactivity is the only answer.
And it's not, you know, it's almost like we've just begun to like chip away at these mental health issues, and now we're taking this big step back. And, you know, when we look at the purpose of the special education laws, when we look at the purpose of the IDEA and the spirit, the purpose is to, you know, prepare kids for life outside school, right? Socially, emotionally, behaviorally, physically, all these things. And, you know, we've had a year of not being able to do that. So, you know, as Andy said, in the fall, we're really just going to start seeing, you know, what has happened as a result of COVID. And if, you know, people take away one thing from this, it's these districts have to have a plan. They didn't plan, you know, who knew it was going to be a few weeks, a few months in March. So, you know, my point of we didn't miss a beat as a firm, but the districts didn't plan well enough for whatever reason. But now let's take the summer. If we can't address some of these things over the summer and come up with a plan for the fall to address these issues. Because as Michael said, you know, if you ask me what area kids are going to suffer the most, and it's the mental health issues. It absolutely is. You know, we can get them tutoring, right? We can, you know, help with the reading or their math skills or something, but these mental health issues are going to be really a challenge. So the districts have to be ready. And, you know, we're attorneys, we're result oriented. It's not about best efforts here. We have to really, you know, get the job done.
Well, let me say that on the good news side, the Connecticut legislature has passed S2, it's on the governor's desk, which requires trauma-informed training, suicide training for all school staff, including related service providers. And then there's separate legislation which hasn't exactly passed yet, but I got language in there to require the school resource officer have the same training, all of which would be a big step forward in dealing with this. So it's not, you know, so things are happening to sort of address these issues. It'll be, you know, too little too late, of course, but it's, but at least the state is facing up to the problem finally.
I just wanted to add to what Courtney said about the emotional disturbance category, that while she's right, some parents see a shame in it, and there's no shame if there's a mental health issue, that also if a child has another disability, whether it's autism or something else, it doesn't mean they don't have a mental health issue. It still can be categorized as autism with a mental health issue, so that parents don't think that they have to put an emotional disturbance to get mental health services. You can get mental health services with an autism classification or any other classification if it's comorbid. I mean, I've seen kids with dyslexia who get depression from feeling stupid. So I think we have to be mindful that mental health doesn't just exist under the emotional disturbance label, but all labels. And it's particularly going to be there for kids on the spectrum. And as Andy said, we don't even know what we're going to see in the fall.
Well, let me just expand on that. Look, kids qualified under a single disability, but the IEP needs to identify all areas of disability. And once an area is identified, you need goals and objectives in that area, and you need services to provide for it. So it really doesn't matter what the identification label is. If the child needs counseling, if the child needs social support, if a child needs mental health support, that should be in the IEP.
And they need to make reasonable progress in all
Absolutely.
areas. So it can't be, yeah, they have psychosis, but they're categorized as autism. So if they make no improvement in mental health, it's okay. If they improve social skills, it's not how it works. Schools sometimes believe that's how it works. Not all schools. There are some that do a really good job. But yeah, there's a real disconnect between really understanding it's a whole child, head to toe, and then all areas of suspected disability must be explored, all areas of disability must be addressed, and you must show measurable progress over time. So that's why we have jobs, because that's the battle drum we beat every day.
Can
And like
you all,
Courtney and Andy just
can you all explore, and this is a question that I received from a participant, what, if any, direct and individualized benefits or services a child with an IEP can ask for or potentially receive as a result of some of the pandemic funds that have been given to school districts?
Well, pandemic funds can be used for any IEP purpose and all sorts of other purposes. Perkins transition services, birth to 3 services, rebuilding the school type services. So, I mean, I think that there's no limit to what you can ask for. Now, there are certain services which are sort of red flags for school personnel. So if you ask for horseback riding, most special ed directors are going to react negatively, although I've gotten that in cases. If you ask for a weekend at the spa for the mother, that's probably going to get rejected, although it may be the educational benefit of the child. But anything that has a relationship to the education of the child is something you can ask for. Moreover, the related services is defined to include parent training, and so education and training for the parent is also services that can be asked for.
And that's something that's a great point, Andy, because I know that I saw a lot of parents at home during the during this period who were cast into multiple roles that they were not prepared to take on. They were supposed to take data on their child. They were supposed to be the para. They were supposed to be the SPED teacher, and in some cases the general ed teacher, and they were not prepared to do any of that. Much less implement an FBA at home, that had been developed at school. So that's a really great point about parent training, which is something that, a lot of parents, don't, I feel like don't ask for enough and aren't able
and to your point, one of the really shocking and disappointing things I found is that when parents came in with really complete data on how the kid did at home, schools tended to dismiss it. It's not our data. We're not going to use it.
Right.
That's outrageous. That is outrageous.
Right. Like their data would have been much better. Whatever.
And jumping on what Andy's saying, I think the problem is parents, and you can be the smartest, most capable parent, but if they're not a trained educator or, like Andy said, a trained para to collect data, you can be a corporate attorney making $500,000 a year and have no idea how to educate your child.
Of course.
And as Courtney said before, you have to take the child as they come. You also have to take the parent as they come.
Absolutely.
And not every parent is going to be able to advocate properly or effectively or know the secrets. And I always say being a parent is one of the most important jobs in the world and one of the few you don't need a license or permit for.
That is true. I don't want to forget, I know this is kind of off topic a little bit, but because Adrian and Andy, you're both here, I wanted you guys to take a minute to talk about the Yorktown case, because it was, such an important case this year.
All right. Andy, do you want me to start
You
or?
can do it. You can do it. I mean, you know,
As Andy said, he's done so many briefs, so many amicus briefs for
You
our,
can't even
our,
keep them
our
straight.
firm. And I want to apologize to him because I haven't even had the chance since this decision came out to thank him for this work. I will tell, I'm going to give you the 5-minute version of this because what I think is really important here is sort of the background of this story. So the cynical me says, you know, some of the districts, some of the attorneys think these parents are only out ever to get a funding for a private school tuition. That's what they want. And this is the MO. And, you know, people do this all the time. And in this Yorktown case, my piece of it, of course, I met this family years ago before this case was filed. And I will tell you, this is the nicest family on my top 3 of families who came in and really wanted to work with the school district to get a reading program. That's all they really wanted. All right. And the backdrop, and I have all these notes here because it's been so many years, is that the first year they went with a non-attorney. We had an advocate in the office and really tried to work with the district. And it was only after exploring every option that they decided at the recommendation of an evaluator, like, this is just not going to work if they don't get if they don't get what they need for the student in district. She is going to struggle forever. You need to make this change, and if they're not going to agree to it, you need to place the student at Eagle Hill. And so that's how this case started. So, you know, point 1 for the participants is this should really say these parents tried every way possible to keep, their goal was to keep her in district. So this was a case that went on many years. When we got to this, which this case in the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, you have to remember too that we lost at the hearing level. So the backdrop is we lose at hearing because the hearing officer sort of said no harm, no foul. There weren't enough procedural violations. They amended the IP. But remember, for people and anybody that wants a copy of the case, they can just email me and I'll send it to them. And Christine, I think I
I have it.
gave
Yeah,
it to
I have
you.
it. I can send it
So,
around in the.
Yeah, so we lose at hearing. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, and I think everybody here, is we never give up. So we were not just going to say, okay, well, you lost. So we appealed to the Office of State Review and we win. And the state review says, and I'm going kind of back and forth, but they say, look, he says, you could never provide what you told the parent you were going to provide in the IEP in June, and you don't give the parent an IEP until August. And by that time, they had already made the decision to place the student. So, you know, you waited too long. And so we appeal, we win at state review, and then the district appeals to the district court, and the district court affirms the decision. They go, you know what, you made a mistake. Like you have to pay this tuition. The parents relied on this IEP that indicated a class that you didn't even have in the district. And no, you can't change the IEP during the resolution period. That's not the time. And so they appealed to the circuit. And that's how this really played out. But really the holding of the case is that, you know, the Court of Appeals says, we affirm holding that the IDEA does not permit a school district to amend an IEP unilaterally.
During
Because
the
what
30-day
they-
resolution period.
I'm
During the
sorry?
resolution- Sorry, during the
During
resolution
the
period.
resolution period. They can't come in and just unilaterally say, oh yeah, we made a mistake. We'll just amend it during the 30-day resolution period. the act envisions the resolution period as a time for mediation and agreement, not just a one-sided action. So that's really important, because if they didn't rule this way, then what would it say? A parent could come in, file for due process, and then unilaterally, the district could come in during that 30-day resolution period and just try to fix everything so that they moot out the issues, okay? The parent had to rely on an IEP that was developed to make a decision what to do for the following year.
Yeah.
If this court had ruled differently, what would the parent rely on? You know, the district tried
It's
to
like a
say
moving
that.
target, you know, it's like a moving
Yeah,
target,
it would be
you
a
know,
moving,
yeah.
you know what, Christine, exactly. Would it be a moving target?
No.
The district tried to say that if the court ruled this way, it would allow the parents to be like opportunists. And the court says that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And the IDEA never intended for the district to be able to, you know, amend unilaterally. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is really important for parents,
Yeah.
because if
It
the
protects that
district,
period. It protects that.
yeah,
time.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And it
Um,
forces the, you know, and it forces the school district, I shouldn't say force, that's the wrong word, but it motivates everyone to use that period as it's meant to be used, you know.
Right. And I
It's a
think,
working
and I'll
together process.
you know, I'll say just one more thing about it. But again, I want to stress that this is really, it shows a family that oh, and by the way, let me just, Christine, I told you this. This family came, Andy, I'm not sure if you remember this. They came to the oral argument.
They did.
And that really doesn't happen very often. This
Right.
is how invested they were in this.
Yeah.
They were a great family, but the court, you know, the court did reference a case in New York City, RE, to drive home the fact that the parents must be able to rely on a written finalized IEP to
Right.
make a decision on whether to unilaterally place a
Right.
student. And although
And
the
not have it
district,
pulled out from under their, like, you know, not
Yeah.
have it pulled out from underneath
Yeah.
them.
so, you know, they can work with the family during that resolution period to try and resolve the issues, but they just can't go back and unilaterally
Change the.
make these changes. So as simple as this holding is, it's huge for parents.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we are grateful to Andy and others that came in and really supported this. Andy, do you have anything to say? Because you were really boots on the ground with this piece
Yeah, I
of
mean,
it.
I want to, you know, look, the RE decision, which actually was another Cuddy case, and actually a case that we actually won.
Well,
uh,
no, Ari was Gary, so, right?
Okay,
Gary?
RE's Gary. Well,
Yeah,
what it said was that after the IEP has been produced, the district can go ahead and explain what they meant
Right.
in the decision. And then there was some loose language in there about, of course, they can make modifications during the resolution period. The language was just an example of poor judging, of throwing out a statement which was not supported by the law. And that gave the board in Yorktown the ability to argue, see, the court already said you can change during the resolution period. And so the challenge of the case was not the basic concept, which I don't think there was any disagreement about, that, you know, that you can't pull the rug out from under. The challenge was to get the Second Circuit to admit that they had made a mistake. And in the decision, they didn't quite say that, but
Right.
they just about said that.
And I think, you know, and I think that what they were, the board was taking that language in RE, and I didn't want to take credit for somebody else's, that's why I'm saying it was Gary's case, but they were saying, listen, you know, you're misinterpreting. Yeah, they can come in and they can modify, but it can't be unilaterally. They
Right.
can't just come in and go, yeah, oops, because as
Right. Let's fix
Christine
it.
and I were talking about this, it would be a moving target. The parents had to rely on something. And the interesting thing with this case is that the parents asked afterwards, like, I don't understand whether it was 15-1. I don't understand. Yeah, I don't think you have this. And they went back and asked after this June meeting, are you sure? Like,
Mhm.
can you tell me again? And
Yeah.
nobody could give them an answer.
Yeah.
And I really think that the court
Because there wasn't an
knew
answer.
that
Yeah, exactly.
this parent, because part of the claim for reimbursement has to be that the parents cooperated. And in other cases, you see maybe that the parents didn't cooperate fully, or they didn't
Yeah.
really understand. Not only did they cooperate, they went back and said, are you sure?
Right.
Are you sure? So that's really, I mean, for us, this was an incredible win, and especially because this family was just so great. So
It's always great when
Um,
you have a great family. I know
it
that,
is.
obviously. Well, thank you for that, for that summary. It is a really important decision, and I will send it around with the, with the recording of the webinar after the presentation has been over. I haven't yet figured out how to post things like that to Facebook, but maybe someone will enlighten me. I would love.
I just want to underline
Yeah.
one thing that Adrian just said.
Go ahead.
In order to get reimbursement for unilateral placement, you have to first prove that the district's programs is inappropriate. You then secondly have to show that the program you're proposing is appropriate. And then the third prong is the equity prong,
Mhm.
where there's a duty of parents to cooperate.
Mhm.
It is often a problem
Yeah.
that parents try to assert rights in a way which
Yeah.
shows lack of cooperation and are deprived reimbursement because of it. It's an
Absolutely.
equitable remedy.
Yeah.
Andy,
That's a
you
great
know
point.
what? If I can just, one last thing, I cannot stress how important the cooperation is, because I think parents, they're afraid of what they say. And if this real, even though they didn't get to the equities piece of this, it was so crucial, I think, in the discussion of the case, to see how much this family cooperated.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like, Andy, sometimes either they're afraid or they feel like they're going to manipulate, because it will go against them if they,
Well, that's
go to
definitely what you
work.
feel. I mean, as a parent, like that's definitely what you feel,
Yeah. And
but you have to balance that obviously with, there's also a real level of fear, at a parent, from a parent's perspective about, that, involvement. But I do,
Well, there should be. You go to these meetings. It's a mugging. It's one parent and 15 school personnel all talking a language that you don't understand. Why shouldn't parents be afraid?
Yeah. It's
I just want to follow on what
It's,
Andy and Adrian
Everything you
said.
say, Kenan, will be used against you.
That's absolutely
Always.
right.
They will
That's
take
absolutely right.
one thing you say that's positive. You could say, you denied FAPE, my kid can't read, they don't want to come to school, but he has a good connection with the
Speak the
cafeteria.
language, whatever. Doesn't,
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
He's got a great, parents said he's got a great relationship with staff.
Yeah, exactly.
All that goes in.
And that's what I always tell parents, you have to cooperate. Even and I get parents who were like, I've been cooperating with them 5, 6, 7 years. I'm fed up. I'm like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You can't get reimbursement if you don't.
We are just about around 8 o'clock, and I wanted to get to a question that a couple of participants had emailed me about, and that is the both the Biden budget, which includes increases in special education funding, as well as the American Rescue Plan. And how those things, I think over the next, I think that'd be a great way to kind of wrap up our discussion, is to talk about the, what you all, with your lens on the world, on this world, expect to come from both of those, both those pieces of, of legislation, should they come to pass.
All right, let me talk briefly about. So first, on special ed funding, when the IDA was passed in 1975, there was a commitment that the federal government was going to pay 40% of the special ed costs around the country. The federal government's never come anywhere close. It's not. It has been at around 12, 13% for the last couple of years. President Biden on the campaign trail promised to get to full funding in 10 years. And in his first budget has increased the amount by 2%, a little over $2 billion of funding to take us up to about 15%. That's in his budget. That is not passed yet, but there's reason to believe that it will. The American Rescue Plan, which has passed,
Yes.
had a slot of money for special education just to fund IDA for 1 year as the regular IDA appropriation and an increase in funding. Plus it had a massive amount of money, 1.1 billion in Connecticut, 110 billion nationwide for education. That money, 90% of it has to go to local school districts. It is distributed in accordance with Title I formula, which is heavily weighted towards students in poverty. So indeed, there are 8 out of the 200 Connecticut school districts that aren't getting a penny out of it. And towns like Bridgeport and Hartford and New Haven are getting substantial chunks. Now, the American Rescue Plan, for the first time, requires a heightened level of stakeholder participation. Now, this is something that the state actually has been holding panels on it, but local districts don't seem to have gotten the message, and they're going ahead with their normal process of proposing the spending the money. And so it's really important that parents get in the face of local school boards and say, you got to listen to us, and we've got to talk about what's available. Finally, there's a wide range of things that American Rescue Plan money can be used for. What we're seeing is a lot of school districts are doing 2 things with it. One, providing bonuses for teachers for the amount of work they did last year to sort of get rid of the money. And 2, bricks and mortars, but building new buildings. Neither of those, yes, air conditioning is probably important, particularly in urban schools. But in terms of long-term influence, the money should be spent on uptraining staff, particularly in social emotional learning and trauma-informed care, so that the money, which has to be obligated by September 30th of 2024, continues to have an effect into the future.
Yeah.
But
bonuses and air conditioning are easy. They're easier to do.
Right.
And they're the priority, always special ed is the last priority, always.
Absolutely.
And that's got such an impact on society, a long-term impact on our entire society, and it's just completely missed. And it's always my concern when a district gets a big chunk of funding of how it's managed. I've been disappointed many times. You can be so creative. You can have a poorer district do a better job than a more affluent district because they have a good leadership. They prioritize what's important. They're honest. Yep, your client's been bullied. This is our plan. You know what I mean? They don't lie about it, and they see less people like us. So it's not like you need $1 billion to provide an appropriate education. You really don't. What you need is teachers who want to teach the unteachable. I love those teachers that get excited to teach my clients, and you need to give them the tools and the motivation and reinforcers to do that. And it takes people who really want to work with parents. And just like I said, it always starts at the top. Who the superintendent is, who the special ed director is, who the principal is.
They set the tone for the whole. They set the tone for the whole of the district. They set the tone as to whether or not we are we're educating and we're learning and we're inclusive and we're bringing in, or if we're denying, delaying, obfuscating, whatever. That starts at the top. Absolutely.
And I think
the expectation. Yes.
I think what Courtney said is very important too, because I think that so many kids, Andy's talking about the money, but in many cases, this money is for now and for this year and maybe next year. But I think, Courtney said it before, children are not going to just need services this year or next year. These kids are going to need services for years on end. And what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years when these kids still are dealing with the effects of this year, even though to most people, COVID will be the past. And, like Courtney said about the unteachable, I was considered one of those unteachable kids, and now I'm an attorney. No kid is unteachable. You just have to find out how to reach the kid.
Amen.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for, for joining us this evening. I wanted to wrap up on what, our panelists are hoping to see over the course of the next year. We've talked about, some of the things that we've seen that children have experienced during the pandemic. We've talked about some, school districts that have done well, some that have done poorly. What, as we look out over 2021 and 2022, what do you hope to see in special education over the next year?
I would like to see districts be creative and really look at what happened over this year. How do we address the issues, take one student out, and in districts like New York City is pretty hard, but let's be creative with solutions and recovery. That's what I really want. And not to litigate every single case.
Absolutely. Michael?
I want to,
I want districts to realize the more you spend now trying to deprive the child of services, going to a hearing, doing what you're doing to deprive them, it's going to cost you more in the long run. And it's going to cost taxpayers more, because ultimately children with disabilities become adults with disabilities.
Yeah.
And you can give services now from 3 or 5 to 18 for 15 to 20 years, or you can pay services for 60 years for the rest of their life. And those services are going to be a lot more for housing and food and clothes, things that are not covered in special ed. So it's all taxpayer money, even if it's coming out of the school budget versus federal budget.
I mean, one of the things that I always talk about, when I talk to people who don't, do this, for a living, not that I do this, but you know what I mean, is that, if you graduate from high school and you can't read, and I have seen more kids, through this. I mean, when we started SELF, I was like, I'm going to see all these kids with autism because, like, I'm a mom of a child with autism, and, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But, I have been shocked by the number of kids that have been in the system for 10 years and can't read. And those kids, if they graduate and they can't read, they can't hold jobs. They can't be productive members of society. So this system and the way that, the system has worked is really, sort of penny wise, pound foolish, because at the end of the day, are you saving your, your local school district, a little bit of money, maybe, but you're pushing that cost ultimately onto society. And it's a much longer, more expensive, societally expensive, proposition at that point.
But people are short-sighted. People don't think 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They think a year or two at a time.
Right. That is true. Andy, your hopes for the future, and then Courtney, I cut you off there, but we can wrap up on your hopeful note for the next year in special education.
All right, my hopeful note is that we do something about the incredible, pervasive, structural racism in American education, that we eliminate exclusionary discipline, the suspensions and expulsions and police referrals, which are totally directed at kids with disabilities and kids of color, that we start funding our urban districts at the same level as the suburban districts. In Connecticut, the average New Canaan kid gets $21,000 spent on him. The average Bridgeport kid has $14,000 spent on him. And Bridgeport has all these English language learners and free and reduced lunch kids and special ed kids that New Canaan does not have.
Well, it goes ultimately.
That's my hope, and I hope that we start treating children as human beings and stop restraining and secluding them. How's that?
Absolutely, that's perfect. Courtney?
I hope that schools take this as a refresh, because right now everything's kind of up in the air. We haven't totally gone back mask free. So there's a blank slate in many ways to do things differently and to learn. So the system we had before was so broken. And when I was in school in the 70s and the 80s, it's the same. We haven't changed it. The buildings look the same. The language is the same. And the population of people being hurt by this system is getting bigger and bigger. Our prisons are full of people who have unmet special education needs. That's ridiculous. Our homeless shelters are full of people who had unmet special education needs. The financial impact, what you pay in federal taxes, is way more than you pay in your town taxes, which goes towards your education budget and your special education budget. So I hope people take an opportunity, as Andy said, these are humans, they're not numbers. Stop looking at them as numbers. Stop calling them, things that are not human. What does this child need? Let's get creative. Let's team together and not talk about budget and test scores, but get excited and energized on how to help these kids, because when they are, then the kids are, and there's this whole domino effect. Because I always say this, they're in school for at least 30 hours a week for 12 years. The opportunity for healing, the opportunity for support, for education, there's no excuse in going into 2022 next year that we have kids who are dyslexic that can't be taught to read. Like, come on. There's no excuse. We have kids on the spectrum who they're saying, oh, they're not eligible. We don't have to give social skills to. I mean, come on. Antiquated system, be gone. Start really looking at what you know to be true and help these kids. Help kids who are in the LGBTQ community. I hope I didn't get that wrong. Especially help people who are being discriminated against based on race, based on religion, based on anything. Disability, bring these kids in, make them valuable members of society, and then people will stop thinking these are kids that you can hurt, discriminate just because of what's going on for them. I just think that we can do a refresh. Let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you are interested in a replay of this webinar, it will be available on our website, Facebook, YouTube, and Vimeo pages. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists, Attorney Andy Feinstein, Attorney Adrienne Arkontaki, Attorney Michael Gilbert, and Attorney Courtney Spencer, as well as the talented and tenacious Marie Langell and her interpretive skills for the evening. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie, for keeping up with lawyers, because we talked about
Yes.
that.
And we're talking over everybody. Thank you guys. Good night.
Good night. Have a good
everybody.
night.